There's a lot of debate over how often you should do hard sparring. And it's a reasonable debate to be had, actually, because different people have different tolerances and different people have different needs. So there's not really a one size fits all answer, but I'm going to try to get as close to that as I can. So there are a few things that we have to take into consideration. Uh, First, we need to know kind of like what is the purpose of sparring, right? We did a whole video on what is sparring. But one of the components of sparring, right? Obviously, right, you're looking to, your decision-making matrix and how to put things together on the fly against a resisting opponent. The question here isn't how much of that. The question is at what level of resistance, right? And at what level of obstacle. But one of the other big things about sparring is its stress response. You don't get that stress response training from things that don't involve risk. So there is an inherent level of risk necessary to sparring. Now, again, because of intensity, we can modulate that quite a bit. But the lighter you go, which is very important, light sparring is very, very important. But the lighter you go, the more you are denying yourself of dealing with that stress response. So that is something that you have to address. Now, the next thing that we have to look at is that intensity is going to cause fatigue. Well, intensity and volume, right? Think of this like fitness. Intensity and volume both are going to contribute to fatigue. Intensity, of course, is going to require more of your systems driving energy, from your cells all at once, right? And more volume is just going to be draining the batteries just at a lower level, but over a longer period of time. Both contribute to fatigue in a significant way. The other thing we have to consider, and this is very much an intensity thing, is injury. Now, look, again, there is a certain level of risk that is necessary and inevitable in sparring. But the harder you go, the more likely you are to get injured. And again, we see this in the lifting world, right? We see this paralleled really well in the lifting world. There are basically no technique correlations to injury. The only seeming correlation to injury is that you are loading unprepared tissues faster than before they're ready, right? And because of that, that generally means that heavier lifting, if you misgroove a heavier lift, all of a sudden you're shifting load to tissues that are not conditioned to that, and you can cause injury, compensation and whatnot. Right? And then, of course, the speed at which it happens is important there too. So injury is a pretty big deal here, because the harder you go in sparring, the more likely you are to make snap decisions that don't work out exactly in your favor. Now look, we've talked about this before, but there's a certain amount of margin that you have on any given technique or tactic. There has to be, because the realities of a fight don't allow you to do things in an ideal fashion all the time, and it's very difficult to control that. So that is an important factor as well. Another factor that we have to look at is, of course, are you a competitive fighter, or are you, somebody who is recreational or using training as an insurance policy, right? Is somebody who is engaged more like self-defense kind of stuff. If you are not competing, which means you are not getting that regular, and I say regular, but I mean, how many fights a year do people really have? I mean, it depends on what sport you're involved in. It depends on what the regulatory atmosphere is around that. It depends on your personal tolerances and desire to do so. But most people are only fighting a couple of times a year. If we're talking full contact stuff, grappling, you can do quite a bit more, but that's another story. But if you're competing, you may not need as much hard sparring, because you are going to be getting that stimulus through the actual competition. Now, I would argue that you probably don't want to save all of that only for competition, because competitions are where your stakes are going to be highest outside of an actual real world conflict. But that's a key factor. And for me, what this boils down to is the idea of, again, paralleling to the lifting world, is comparing this to how often you do your 1 rep max. Because all of this kind of figures in, even the stress response to a degree, right? And for sure the competition response, to 1 rep max training. All of that figures in. So I figure that you should probably be doing hard sparring about as often as you test your 1 rep max. As long as you're not doing Bulgarian training, right? What's interesting on this though is that's not a static number. There's no like scientific data for how often you should 1 rep max. Now, maybe they could test that. I have a feeling that you would have rather heterogeneous data, which would fundamentally make the average kind of a useless thing. You would absolutely have to have the spread with that. But some people will max out much more frequently. Some people will max out much less frequently. I believe, and don't quote me on this, I haven't looked it up and I'm probably not going to, but I believe Ed Cohen said that he only maxed out like twice a year outside of competition. And again, then like you look at the Bulgarian method and they're maxing out all the time. Again, we're kind of setting them aside as a separate thing because most people don't endorse or follow that. And you might look at go, because I've talked about Westside before, you might go, well, what about Westside? They max out every week. But there's a caveat there, right? Because with Westside, you're almost never maxing out on the actual competition lift. You're usually maxing out on variations, and almost all of the variations you're doing, if they're heavier variations, they're going to be partials or something like that. And if they're other variations, they're generally going to be lighter, which means they're not going to be contributing quite as much to the fatigue and whatnot because it's below your regular threshold. And that's pretty important, right? And that also brings to mind the idea that just because you're not necessarily hard sparring, you could actually still be going hard on pads and bags. You have some, you could be going really hard on shadow boxing. You have options to fill in those gaps through variations on the training as opposed to just pure sparring, which is going to massively cut down on things like injury and over fatigue from going too hard too often. So that's a big deal. Now let's come back to this competition thing, right? If somebody is a competitive fighter, let's assume that they're fighting 4 times a year, right? That I don't have any data to back that up or anything, but let's just say they're fighting 4 times a year. They're fighting quarterly. 12 weeks of training to get to a competition. Now, this could be varieties of competition. They could be doing like an MMA match. They could be doing a kickboxing match. They could be doing a grappling match. Plenty of fighters are doing a lot more. Plenty are doing quite a bit less. Look, some of these guys in Thailand have like 300 fights by the time that they're 20. Old-timey boxers, and not even that old-timey, but I mean, boxers just from the beginning of the 20th century were racking up hundreds of fights. And then was it Sugar Ray Leonard had over 100 or 180 fights or something like that from his amateur and Olympic days before going pro. I mean, look, you can rack up a lot of work, but people don't do that anymore. A lot of athletic commissions won't let you fight that often and things like that. So there's again, the regulatory atmosphere and where you live and where you're competing has a lot to do with it. And then just your personal proclivities. But let's just say on average, right, you're just a normal person that is training and you want to do some competition. You're not necessarily looking to make this a huge career and all that, and you're fighting 4 times a year. It's just because it's an easy number. If you're doing that, right, you may have like a mid-season or mid-training cycle max out session or something like that. So in that case, you might want to be looking at the idea of what some people recommend is like every 6 to 12 weeks you try to max out. And that generally seems to be coming from people that are kind of engaged in occasional competition, right? And with lifting competition, it's usually less frequent than that. But you know, I would hazard to say, if you're not competing, because I think that the hard sparring is going to be more important, because you're going to need to develop that stress response. And if you're not competing, you have to get that stress response from somewhere. And even though hard sparring is still sparring with people who you're friends with and you're still not trying to hurt them per se, it's still going to develop that stress response better than if you just never did it at all. I would hazard to say probably maybe every 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. You know, I definitely don't test my maxes, you know, monthly. You could probably engage in hard sparring monthly, provided you're not taking it to that 100% level. And that's something we're going to get to in a second. You can see there's a lot of kind of fluff and play in this. This is not a static number, and a lot of it's going to come down to you and your tolerances, who you're working with, how much you believe escalation will take it beyond an acceptable point, and all of that. Like, how do we even define what hard sparring is? If you're defining it like, you know, like you would consider your 80% threshold for strength training, which is kind of the accepted cutoff point for where you're still able to develop 1 rep max strength, and 80% is going to correlate to something like, I don't know, 8 reps or 10 reps or something like that. And that's highly individual too. But it's like 80% of your 1 RM is still considered sufficient to develop your 1 RM. Anything below that, you'll still get stronger, but because 1 rep max lifting requires a particular skill component, you have to be handling loads that are going to get you closer to those movement patterns, and kind of that 20% cutoff from 1 RM to 80 seems to be about where people accept that, hey, you're still working more or less the same skill. A lot of people will say, you got to be 90 plus. And look, you can do 90 plus on your lifts. You can do top singles at 90 or even 95 plus weekly without contributing too much, because you're not doing massive volumes with it. Like, you're doing 1 lift. You're just doing it as a top single to expose yourself to a load, and then you back off and do some work that's closer to that 80%, or even lower, doing more, you know, hypertrophy work just to build up that solid baseline of actual tissue. So we can look at the same thing, right? If you're defining hard sparring as kind of like that 80% threshold, then yeah, you can probably do that even weekly, although I would hazard to say that because of the nature of sparring versus lifting, right, because you're going to be clashing bodies at that 80% threshold, and look, you can't really define your sparring effort in percentages, but like 80% of your max output is still probably going to be pretty injurious to people. So we're probably not actually talking about a direct one-to-one correlation there. But if you're talking something in that ballpark of that, getting that hard enough to matter but light enough to not overproduce fatigue and contribute to injury, yeah, you can probably do that like weekly. Especially if you're keeping head contact fairly light and going harder to the body, you can do that pretty regularly. If you're talking something harder, if you're talking more in that realm of what lifters would consider like 90 to 95%, which again in lifting you can do weekly, but because of how we engage in sparring, injury potential is so much higher. Again, not one-to-one correlation, but you might be looking at that maximum monthly, but I would even say probably every 8 weeks, which would correlate pretty well to like a training camp kind of deal. Now look, you're not doing hard sparring at the end of an 8-week training camp. That's definitely not what we're talking about. You know, infamously, Ken Shamrock got cut above the eye before his Kimbo Slice fight or something like that because he was sparring too hard, or it was an escalation. We never did get the full story on that. So you do have to be careful there. But again, I'm saying this more frequent platform is going to be more for the people who are not competing, because they're going to need that, because they're not getting that fuller scope process through actual competition. Yeah, maybe if you are a competitive fighter, maybe your hard sparring is going to come in probably like the first half of your training camp, making sure that escalation doesn't happen to the point of injury, and then you're going to be tapering off to more and more technical work the closer you get to the fight, to minimize fatigue, because that's going to be akin to like a powerlifting peak or weightlifting peak, where you're trying to reduce fatigue but keeping your training stimulus high so that you're ready to perform. So that's its own thing. So again, just to wrap this up, right? How often should you spar hard? And my general rule of thumb is you should probably do hard sparring about as often as you're comfortable doing a 1 rep max, because that's going to keep your injury potential lower. That's going to keep your fatigue lower. That's going to allow you to work much more technical and tactical stuff, because you're not pushing that stress threshold so high that you can't think and strategize. But you do need that stress at some points. So it does have to come in somewhere, whether that's through competition, or that's through periodic hard sparring, let's say quarterly or bi-monthly. That would be my general recommendation. The grand majority of your sparring should be light technical sparring, stuff that, if you were to spar bare knuckle, which we do, if you were to spar bare knuckle, is not going to cause any kind of deep bruising or lacerations, or anything that's going to prevent somebody from training for more than a day, right? You really don't want them to even take a day off, but the idea is that you have to leave wiggle room for inevitable escalation, because we're people with random psychology and whatnot, and you just can't control for every factor. But ideally, you do not want to engage in training that makes you take more than a day off once in a while, too often, because you want to keep that consistent training stimulus high. And that's really the point of it. You want to be able to work on your technique and your tactics and your strategies at a high enough threshold of stress that you're getting some stress response at a low enough level that you're not making bad decisions. You want to keep injury, ideally you want to keep injury out of the equation. That's not realistic. So you want to keep injury to the absolute minimum that you possibly can. You want to keep fatigue managed. I may have already said that. That's what we're looking at. So anyway, that's the wrap up on the video. Spar as often as you're comfortable doing a 1 rep max, and as comfortable as your training partners are doing a 1 rep max, because it takes at least 2 to spar. So I'll wrap it up there, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.